Deep beneath the crumbling barn, where shadows clung to every beam and the cold winter air whispered through the broken boards, an old man knelt with trembling hands. Beside him, his gray and tan German shepherd, Ranger, let out a low, uneasy growl, ears pinned back and amber eyes fixed on the strange slab of concrete buried under decades of dust and forgotten straw. As Henry brushed away the last layer of dirt, his breath caught in his throat. A hidden vault, sealed for over a century, revealed itself beneath his fingertips. When he pried open the heavy lid, the stale air of history rushed out, and neither Henry nor Ranger knew they were about to awaken secrets long buried. A legacy of betrayal, redemption, and a destiny that had been waiting for them all along. The bitter wind swept across Madison County, Missouri, carrying whispers of an early winter. The sky hung low, heavy with gray clouds, and the fields stretched barren beneath a pale, lifeless sun. A cold drizzle clung to the earth, soaking the faded leaves and settling into the bones of the land. Henry Walker, 65 years old, sat hunched on the edge of the creaking wooden porch of his farmhouse, staring at the frost-tipped fields that had once brought him pride. Time had carved deep lines across his weathered face. His gray beard grown uneven, patchy in some spots, giving him a rugged but exhausted appearance. His hands, calloused, knotted from decades of carpentry, rested on his knees as though even lifting them required effort. His thinning silver hair was damp from the mist, sticking slightly to his forehead, and his pale blue eyes carried a quiet heaviness, reflecting years of loneliness more than any words ever could. Henry wasn't always like this. Once he had been known as a proud craftsman, someone whose hands could turn plain oak into living art, whose steady voice used to sing lullabies in a warm, bustling home filled with laughter. But after Sarah, his wife, died in her sleep 7 winters ago, and after his only son, Michael, moved to Kansas City for work, the farmhouse became hollow. It was now filled only with silence, dust, and the occasional sound of wood contracting in the cold. The one soul keeping Henry tethered to the world was Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, a strong, sleek dog with black and tan fur and intelligent amber eyes. Ranger was big, almost 80 pounds of muscle and instinct. But despite his intimidating size, he was gentle with Henry, always curling at his feet during the long nights and resting his chin against Henry's worn boots. Ranger had once been trained as a service dog, bred from a long line of working shepherds, and though life on the farm had dulled some of his edges, his sharp instincts never faded. On this particular night, as rain whispered against the warped roof, Henry sat at the kitchen table with an empty coffee mug in front of him and bills scattered like fallen leaves across the wooden surface. He rubbed his forehead, closing his eyes tightly, the weight of debt and failure pressing against his chest. The bank had already sent 3 warnings. If he couldn't pay off the remaining balance within 2 months, the farm, his home, his memories, his last tie to Sarah, would be gone. "Guess it's just you and me, boy," Henry muttered, scratching behind Ranger's ears as the dog rested faithfully by his side. Ranger licked his hand softly, as if sensing his master's sinking heart. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old shutters. Somewhere in the barn, a loose panel of tin flapped noisily. Henry sighed, pushing himself up from the table, his knees creaking with the effort. The barn roof had been leaking for weeks, and tonight's rain would only make things worse. He grabbed his battered flashlight, slipped on his old work boots, and headed outside, Ranger following close behind. The barn sat 50 feet from the house, its once red paint stripped away by years of weather and neglect. The roof sagged in places, and one side leaned slightly inward, as though the structure itself was tired of standing. Inside, the damp smell of mold and old straw filled the air, mixing with the metallic tang of wet rust from forgotten tools. Henry shone his flashlight upward, tracing the streaks of water dripping steadily from the ceiling beams. He decided to climb up to the loft, hoping to salvage some planks from the old hayloft floor to patch the worst leaks. He moved carefully, his boots pressing against the damp wooden rungs of the ladder as Ranger waited below, whining softly. Henry reached the loft and began pulling aside old boards, tossing aside splintered planks one by one. His breath came heavy as the dust filled his lungs, forcing him to pause and cough into his sleeve. That's when his foot caught on something. A sharp jolt of pain shot through his knee as he stumbled, barely catching himself on the edge of a support beam. His flashlight clattered to the floor below, its weak beam spinning wildly across the walls. Ranger barked sharply, pacing in tight circles beneath him, ears pinned back. Henry cursed softly under his breath, steadying himself. He knelt, rubbing his sore leg when Ranger began scratching furiously at the packed straw beneath the loft ladder. "What is it, boy?" Henry called, frowning. Ranger's barking intensified, his claws tearing into a mound of rotted straw and dust piled against the wooden boards of the ground level. The dog rarely behaved this way unless he sensed something unusual. Henry groaned as he climbed back down, his stiff knees protesting with each step. Kneeling beside Ranger, he began pulling at the straw with his rough hands. Slowly, the damp, foul-smelling hay gave way, revealing a square patch of wood beneath, darker, harder, and unlike the rest of the surrounding floorboards. He swept away the last of the debris, and his heart skipped as his fingertips brushed against something cold and unyielding beneath the wood's cracked surface. Henry cleared the final layer and froze. Embedded into the packed earth, concealed beneath the hay for what must have been decades, was a solid slab of concrete about 3 feet wide. Its gray surface stood out starkly against the surrounding dirt floor, too perfectly cut, too deliberate to be natural. His breath quickened, clouding faintly in the damp air. "What in God's name?" he whispered to himself. Ranger circled the slab, whining softly, his nose pressed against the edges, tail stiff and motionless. The dog's behavior confirmed what Henry was already thinking. This was something hidden, something not meant to be found. He sat back on his heels, palms resting on his thighs, mind spinning. There shouldn't have been any concrete under the barn floor, not in a building this old. This farm had belonged to the Walker family for generations, and Henry knew its every creak and flaw. Yet here, in the heart of his crumbling barn, lay something he had never known existed. Henry's heart thudded steadily in his chest. The rain outside intensified, pounding against the tin roof like a distant drumbeat. The entire barn seemed to grow quieter, as though holding its breath. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the dampness of sweat despite the cold. Part of him wanted to leave it, to pretend he hadn't seen it, to walk away from whatever secrets had been buried here. But another part of him, the same restless curiosity that once drove his young carpenter's hands, refused to let go. Ranger let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the slab as though warning Henry. Henry placed a trembling hand on the concrete surface, feeling the chill of it seep into his skin. Something about the slab felt wrong, not just because it didn't belong there, but because touching it gave him an odd sensation, like brushing against a locked door behind which an untold story was waiting. The storm outside raged louder, and Henry sat there with Ranger at his side, staring at the hidden slab as if time itself had paused. He didn't know yet, but the discovery beneath his barn would change everything. And somewhere, deep inside him, beneath the weight of debts, loneliness, and fading hope, a spark, faint but undeniable, had been lit once more. The rain had settled into a steady whisper, a fine, cold curtain that softened the edges of the fields and turned the air inside the old barn damp and metallic. Henry Walker stood over the square of concrete he and Ranger had uncovered, the gray slab looking strangely out of place against the packed earth and straw-stained floorboards. He tightened his grip on the crowbar, the knotted muscles in his forearms flexing beneath his frayed flannel sleeve, and exhaled through the ache in his ribs. At 65, his frame was still broad and stubbornly solid, but time had threaded stiffness into his joints. Every lift, every twist carried the weight of pride, the stubborn pride of a man who refused to be finished. Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, sat close enough that Henry could feel the dog's warmth at his calf. The shepherd's black and tan coat gleamed faintly even in the dim lantern light, his amber eyes locked on the slab, ears pricked, muscles tight beneath his fur. A low growl hummed in Ranger's throat, the kind of sound he only made when his instincts caught something Henry couldn't yet see. "Easy," Henry murmured, his voice rough and low, worn from years of silence and sawdust. The crowbar's flat tip slipped into the narrow seam where concrete met soil. He leaned his weight forward, pushing, prying, and then the air shifted, a sudden hiss of stale dampness, mold rising sharp and sour. Beneath the tang of rusted metal came something else, older, heavier, as though the ground itself had swallowed a century's worth of secrets. Henry paused, breath misting faintly in the cold, the barn silent except for the soft patter of rain on the roof. Then, with a final grunt, the slab cracked free, rocking against the edge before he pushed it aside. A square opening yawned beneath him. The mouth of a hidden shaft revealed itself, lined with wooden framing darkened from age and damp. In its center, a narrow ladder of rusted metal dropped into darkness, each rung furred with orange corrosion. Henry lowered the lantern, its pale glow spilling into the narrow space, but it barely touched bottom. Ranger leaned forward and sniffed, his nose twitching, ears swiveling toward the depths as though something far below was breathing back at them. The dog gave a sharp, restless whine, pacing once, then sat squarely before the hole, his tail stiff. Henry swallowed hard. His heart thumped unevenly, heavy in his chest, the weight of years compressing into this single moment. This barn had been his father's before him, and his father's father before that. It had always been just wood and tools and silence, but now it held something else, something it had been keeping from him. The first rusted rung creaked as Henry placed his boot on it, testing its strength. For a man who spent decades shaping oak beams and walnut staircases, steel felt unfamiliar underfoot, like stepping into someone else's story. He descended slowly, the lantern swinging low in his left hand, the cold damp air breathing up against his cheeks. The ladder groaned under his weight, flakes of rust tumbling into the black. At the bottom, his boots touched compacted dirt. The lantern illuminated a small chamber, no larger than 3 meters by 3, the walls carved roughly into earth and braced with old timbers blackened with time. Dust floated thick and lazy, spiraling in the soft yellow glow. Against the far wall sat a massive safe, its steel face dulled by age, the embossed letters Diebold Safe and Lock Company barely legible through the film of rust. Its wheel handle was locked solid, edges corroded, the iron groaning faintly when Henry laid his hand against it. Beside it, 3 wooden crates sagged under their own rot, nails rusted to black threads. A cracked leather satchel, edges curled and brittle, leaned in the corner like it had been waiting for someone to come find it. Henry crouched, bones aching, and eased one of the crates open where the wood had already splintered. Inside, folded with deliberate care, were yellow and newspapers, the ink faded but still legible under the lantern light. The top headline read, "Prairie Express Robbery. $50,000 in gold vanishes without a trace." The date, August 17th, 1892. Henry blinked, his breath catching in his throat. The Prairie Express. He'd heard his grandfather mention it once, late one summer night when whiskey loosened his tongue. A train ambushed, passengers terrified, and a fortune in gold stolen, never recovered. But his grandfather had laughed it off as small-town folklore, a tale to entertain restless farmhands. Yet here it was. The paper crackled faintly as he unfolded it further, scanning the details. The names of outlaws, the Pinkerton detectives called in, the rumors that the gold had been hidden somewhere beyond the ridge where the earth remembers. Henry's mind reeled. $50,000 in 1892 gold. By today's worth, that was a fortune. Enough to pay off the bank, rebuild the farm, and more. But this wasn't excitement blooming in his chest. It was unease. Why here? Why beneath his barn? Ranger barked once, sharp and low, the sound bouncing strangely in the confined space. The shepherd stepped to the edge of the ladder above, peering down, tail rigid. Henry folded the newspaper carefully and slipped it back into the crate. His hand lingered on the cracked leather satchel for a moment. Tempted, but he pulled back. Not tonight. Not yet. The damp chill clung to his skin as he climbed the ladder, the lantern's glow shrinking below until the darkness swallowed the chamber whole again. When Henry emerged into the barn, he slid the slab back into place, pressing straw over it until the secret was hidden once more. Ranger was still on guard, pacing tight circles, ears swiveling with every creak of the wind. Henry knelt, pressing a hand to the shepherd's head, grounding himself in the steady thrum of life beneath his palm. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "We'll figure it out. Just not tonight." But even as he closed the barn doors against the rain, the image of the safe, the satchel, and the yellowed headlines burned behind his eyes. And deep down, Henry knew this discovery was only the beginning. The air was thick with damp earth and secrets long buried. Rain whispered steadily against the roof of the old barn as Henry Walker crouched by the wooden crate that had once rested, forgotten, in the darkened cellar beneath his barn. The rusty hinges groaned when he pushed it aside, revealing the cracked, leather-bound journal nestled in the dust. The flickering lantern beside him cast dancing shadows over the stone walls, making the darkness seem alive. Ranger, his loyal German shepherd, lay near the ladder, ears alert, eyes fixed on the cellar entrance like a sentinel guarding an ancient tomb. Henry's fingers, weathered and calloused from years of hard labor, hesitated over the journal's cover. A faded CB was embossed on the front, barely visible under grime. He opened it carefully, the spine groaning in protest. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the corners, ink smudged by time, but legible. His brow furrowed as he began to read. March 9th, 1893. I, Carter Blackwood, write these words for no one. or perhaps for those who one day will need to know the truth, not just of what we did, but why. Henry blinked, the name striking like a cold wind. Blackwood. That name wasn't on any deed he'd ever signed, nor in any town records he'd come across when he'd inherited the farm through a distant cousin. But here, buried under the barn floor, was a direct voice from a man who once called this very ground his own. He turned the page. My brother, Nathaniel, and I were no outlaws, not truly. The men on that train, most of them walked away unharmed, but Prairie Express was carrying more than passengers that night. $50,000 in minted gold coins straight from the federal treasury. We took it all, and then we vanished. Henry's jaw tightened. The Prairie Express. He remembered it vaguely. An old legend in these parts, a mystery whispered by old-timers. Some said it was a ghost story. Others believed the gold had sunk into the Missouri River during a storm. No one had ever found it, but here was the truth, in trembling cursive ink lying heavy in his hands. We came back here after, to our family's land. We buried it beneath the livestock barn, poured a slab over it with our own hands. The Diebold safe holds the most valuable pieces, the gold, the deeds, the letters from our contact inside the railway. Henry swallowed hard and looked across the dim cellar. The iron safe he had discovered earlier sat silent and cold in the corner, its rusted edges devouring the faint light from the lantern. His heart thudded in his chest, a mix of fear and awe, as if he had disturbed something sacred, or cursed. Ranger gave a soft growl, low and uncertain. Henry reached over and scratched behind the dog's ears, murmuring, "It's all right, boy. We're just learning the truth." Turning the page again, his eyes widened. "The Pinkertons are coming. We saw 2 men in Columbia asking about a carpenter with a limp and a tall man with a scar on his cheek. That's me and Nathaniel. It's only a matter of time. I built a vault beneath the vault. If we vanish, they'll never find it. I'd rather rot in the soil of this land than hang like a thief in front of my son." Henry leaned back against the cold stone wall, mind spinning. Carter had been a father, a craftsman like himself, a man torn between guilt and survival. He imagined him now, a bearded man with calloused hands, perhaps in his late 30s, hammering boards and pouring cement in the dead of night, his brother watching the shadows. The fear in those entries wasn't just fear of lawmen, it was fear of legacy, of losing everything they'd built, not just the gold. Henry stared at the flickering lantern and muttered, "This place, this farm, it wasn't just handed down from nowhere, it's theirs. I'm living in their bones." Ranger nudged him with a gentle whine, sensing the tension. Henry nodded. "I know, boy. I know." He closed the journal gently, placing it back into the crate. He didn't need to read more. The message was clear. This wasn't just about gold. It wasn't just about history. This was about blood, about choices, about the stories no one tells, the ones that hide beneath floorboards and breathe in the silence. Back on the ladder, Henry climbed slowly into the barn. The rain had picked up, tapping faster against the roof like hurried footsteps. He glanced around at the shadows, then down at the trapdoor he gently closed behind him. A part of him had changed in that cellar. A part of him that still grieved his wife, that felt the ache of his estranged son's absence, now clung to something different. Purpose. The name Blackwood echoed in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder, had fate brought him here by chance? Or had this land been waiting for him all along? He looked down at Ranger, who stood beside him faithfully, as always. "Let's go inside," he whispered. "We've got a lot to think about." As they stepped out into the misty yard, Henry no longer saw a dying farm with a leaking roof. He saw something deeper, older, a story trying to surface, and in the whispering rain, he could almost hear the ghosts of the past urging him forward. The following Tuesday arrived wrapped in gray clouds and the promise of rain. Henry Walker stood outside the modest brick building of First Northern Bank of Duluth, hat in hand, papers folded neatly under his arm. His eyes, pale blue and tired, scanned the sign as if hoping for a better name, a softer institution, something less sharp. Behind him, Ranger waited patiently beside the truck, ears twitching each time someone passed too close. Inside, the bank was all polished tile and glass that reflected the weariness of every farmer who stepped in. Henry had come with a simple request, a modest loan to help repair the roof, patch the silo, maybe give the fields one last season before winter. The banker, a young man with gelled hair and a smile as thin as his frame, had nodded politely, taken Henry's papers, and then asked a question that made the old veteran's stomach drop. "There seems to be an unusual mention on the title," he said, flipping through the papers. "Something recent. You filed new survey documentation." Henry's brow furrowed. "Just had the land resurveyed for insurance, that's all. Why?" The man shrugged. "There's been interest. Historical Preservation Office reached out this morning. Something about foundations older than recorded. Civil War era, maybe." Henry didn't answer, just thanked the man, left quietly, and drove home with a hollowness blooming in his chest. That evening, as dusk began to settle like ash across the tree line, a black SUV turned onto Henry's gravel road. Ranger's ears perked. The dog let out a short bark, not aggressive, not yet, but his body stood stiff as the vehicle rolled to a stop near the front porch. Out stepped a tall man in his late 40s with a tailored charcoal coat that gleamed with raindrops. He had a strong build, not overly muscular but compact, deliberate. His hair was dark with streaks of silver at the temples, and his jaw, square and clean-shaven, held tension like a coiled spring. Thin-rimmed glasses framed cold, calculating eyes. "I'm looking for Mr. Henry Walker," the man said, his voice smooth and practiced. "You found him," Henry said, stepping out onto the porch, arms crossed. "Douglas Prescott." The man extended a gloved hand. "A pleasure. I believe we have business to discuss." Henry didn't shake it. Prescott withdrew his hand without flinching and looked around. "Charming place. Bit rugged, but there's history here, isn't there?" "I suppose." Prescott's eyes narrowed slightly, like a man measuring angles. "I understand you've recently uncovered certain artifacts, a subterranean vault, perhaps?" Henry's jaw clenched. "I didn't report anything." "No, but banks have ears, and small towns have looser lips than whiskey bottles, and you, sir, have made inquiries. Documents, permits, geological scans, all traceable." He smiled, thin and wolfish. "You see, my grandfather, William Prescott, spent 40 years investigating the Prairie Express incident. He was the lead federal agent on the case, the one who followed Carter and Nathaniel Blackwood to the ends of their trail until they vanished. That vault you found? That gold? It belongs to my family. My grandfather lost everything chasing it, his reputation, his rank. He died with a map in his hands and ridicule in the papers." Henry stared at him unmoved. That sounds like a family story, not a deed." "Oh, but it will be," Prescott said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a rolled document. "I've already filed a petition with the Duluth Historical Commission to designate your barn and surrounding acreage as a site of historical significance. Once granted, any excavation or alteration will require state approval." Henry didn't touch the paper. "And if I don't agree?" Prescott's smile widened. "This isn't about agreement. It's about legacy, mine, and I assure you I don't let things slip through my fingers." Ranger let out a low growl, almost inaudible, but Prescott's gaze shifted briefly toward him. "I'd advise keeping that mutt away from me," he said coolly. "Some dogs don't understand boundaries." "He understands plenty," Henry replied, "like when a snake slithers in dressed like a gentleman." The two men locked eyes. Something ancient passed between them, an understanding that this wasn't a conversation. It was a warning. Prescott stepped back slowly. "You've made your position clear. I'll let the lawyers take it from here." He turned, but before he reached the SUV, he paused. "One last thing. The Blackwoods, they were thieves, murderers, men who doomed anyone near them. Be careful where you place your sympathy, Mr. Walker." And then he drove off, tires spitting gravel behind him. Henry stood in the silence that followed, the wind picking up slightly through the trees. Ranger moved beside him, eyes still on the trail of the SUV, tail stiff and unmoving. Henry bent down and placed a hand on the dog's back. "Well, boy," he murmured, "looks like the past isn't done with us yet." The land beneath his boots felt heavier than before, as if it remembered everything Prescott claimed, and more. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It came down in sheets that blurred the windshield of Henry's old truck and painted the courthouse steps in a slick, reflective sheen. Ranger sat silently in the passenger seat, eyes scanning the courthouse lawn as if sensing something beyond the veil of water. Henry sighed, pulling his coat tighter as he stepped out into the storm. The courthouse in Madison County was a weathered structure of red brick and gray stone, with wide-arched windows that looked like they had once witnessed duels of words and pride. Inside, it smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and something faintly metallic, perhaps history itself. Henry shook the rain from his hat and entered the records office. Behind the desk sat a woman in her late 50s, with a face carved from discipline and a voice like a librarian who'd won too many arguments. Her nameplate read Beatrice Alden. She was tall and lean, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and glasses that hung from a delicate chain around her neck. She looked up as he approached, then gave him the kind of tight-lipped nod reserved for strangers with purpose. "I'm looking for land ownership records," Henry said, "particularly involving the Blackwood family, late 1800s. Beatrice tilted her head. "You a lawyer?" "No, just connected to the land. I think something important was missed." That answer seemed to satisfy her, or at least pique her curiosity. She stood with surprising speed and led him down a narrow hallway lined with rust-colored file cabinets and oil paintings of unsmiling judges. At the end of the corridor was a locked archive room. "Everything pre-1900s in here," she muttered, unlocking the door. "Try Section 12, railroad disputes, territorial claims, land deeds." For the next 2 hours, Henry combed through dust-choked boxes and brittle folders until his fingers found a folder labeled Blackwood v. Missouri Pacific Railroad, 1897. He pulled it gently from its resting place and opened the flap. There it was. A ruling signed and sealed by Judge Merriweather dated June 3, 1897. Carter Blackwood, having defended his land and possessions against claims by the Missouri Pacific Railroad, had not only won the case but secured a legal declaration that everything on and beneath the land, including assets related to the Prairie Express incident, was the lawful property of his family. The final paragraph stopped Henry cold. In perpetuity, said holdings are to remain with the registered owner of the land known as Parcel 42 of Madison County, as recorded. No future claims by railroads, private corporations, or government entities shall override this ruling. He blinked. Parcel 42. That was his property now, bought, taxed, and tilled by his own two hands, which meant the treasure was legally his. No matter what Prescott said, no matter what schemes were underway. Henry returned the file carefully and took a scanned copy, thanking Beatrice, who eyed him with quiet curiosity. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I did," he said, "and maybe more than I expected." Before leaving town, Henry made one more stop, the Madison Historical Society. The building was less official than the courthouse, more like an overgrown museum, filled with antique maps, yellowed portraits, and an old woman behind the counter who looked like she had personally dated half the Civil War soldiers whose faces adorned the walls. Her name was Martha Glencoe, a local historian in her 80s with soft curls of white hair and the uncanny ability to quote newspaper articles from 1890 by memory. Short and slightly hunched, she wore a red knit shawl and smelled faintly of lavender and tobacco. Henry explained his interest in Carter Blackwood, and Martha's eyes lit up like a child discovering a long-lost toy. Carter and Nathaniel were legends, she whispered, but misunderstood. Most people think they were criminals, but that's not true. They were whistleblowers. The gold from Prairie Express was taken by railroad executives. The Blackwoods were trying to return it to the workers who never got paid after the crash. Henry was stunned. That's never been recorded. No, Martha said softly, because history is written by the victors, and Prescott's grandfather made sure their version became the truth. Back home, Henry paced the floor of his kitchen, Ranger watching from his usual spot by the door. The discovery had given him a surge of purpose, but it hadn't come soon enough. That evening, a letter arrived, hand-delivered by a courier in a Navy windbreaker who didn't say a word. It was from the town council. The vote had been accelerated. Prescott had successfully pushed for an emergency session. In 48 hours, the land would be temporarily declared a site of potential historical interest, giving the council legal authority to halt any activity on it. Henry crushed the letter in his fist. He looked at Ranger. The dog was standing now, ears erect, his eyes steady on Henry as if waiting for him to act. The old man placed a hand on his companion's head. "We're running out of time, old friend." The wind that night had a sharper bite than usual, whistling through the wooden slats of the barn and rattling the shutters on the windows like a warning too old to ignore. Henry had barely slept since the letter from the town council arrived. He knew Prescott wouldn't wait for bureaucracy to take its course, not when something more direct could be done under the veil of darkness. At precisely 2:13 a.m., a deep growl tore through the silence. Ranger was already on all fours by the front door, hackles raised, his body taut like a drawn bowstring. The German shepherd, now 7 years old, was a massive figure, black and tan fur sleek with rain, his amber eyes glowing like twin lanterns in the dim light of the hallway. Henry reached for the shotgun by the wall, but paused when Ranger bolted toward the rear of the house, snarling. Henry followed, heart pounding, and threw aside the curtain of the kitchen window. Beyond the tree line, at the edge of his land where the field sloped into the darkness, sat a black SUV, its lights off, its windows tinted. From the driver's side, a figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark rain poncho that hung to his knees. A second man slipped out the passenger door, shorter but no less purposeful in his movements. They moved low, like men who had done this before. Henry's mouth tightened into a grim line. He opened the back door slowly, the hinges groaning despite his efforts. Ranger was already outside, moving silently along the porch, eyes locked on the intruders. Henry raised his phone, capturing the vehicle's license plate, then zoomed in on the men. One of them held what looked like bolt cutters. The other carried a black duffel bag. As the figures neared the barn, specifically the trapdoor that led to the hidden cellar, Ranger erupted. He bounded down the porch steps and across the field in an explosive sprint, barking like a war drum. The taller man flinched and pulled something from his coat, possibly pepper spray, possibly worse, but Ranger didn't stop. With a guttural snarl, he launched himself forward. The men didn't wait. They ran, dropping the bag, crashing through the underbrush toward the SUV. Tires squealed seconds later, spraying mud as they sped away down the gravel road. Henry exhaled, chest heaving. He hurried to Ranger's side, kneeling by the bag. Inside were plastic ties, a crowbar, and something that made his skin crawl, a folded tarp. "Prescott's not waiting anymore," he muttered. "He's sending shadows." Back inside, Henry wiped rain from his face and stared at the flickering lamplight dancing across the wood-paneled walls. Sleep was out of the question. He had to act. In the barn, beneath the trapdoor, was the carefully hidden vault where Carter Blackwood had stored what remained of his family's legacy. It wasn't just gold and currency, it was testimony, documented truth. With slow reverence, Henry pulled the hatch open, feeling the cold breath of the earth rise to meet him. Ranger followed, ever watchful, his paws silent on the old wooden rungs of the ladder. Below, the chamber was as Carter described it, lined with cedar, reinforced with iron brackets, and bone dry despite decades of weather above. Henry had only explored it partially until now. Tonight he'd go deeper. In the far corner lay a chest with a rusted latch. Henry opened it and carefully removed its contents. A cloth bundle of old Confederate bills, several gold coins stamped 1874, and the crown jewel, Carter Blackwood's personal journal. Bound in thick leather, its edges curled from age, the cover bore the family's crest, a raven clutching a branch. He snapped photos of everything, each page, each coin, each marker of provenance. His phone battery blinked red, but he ignored it. These images could mean the difference between ownership and erasure. He wrapped the most important items in a waterproof satchel, then sealed the hatch once more. It was 4:30 a.m. when he finally returned to the house. Ranger, never once leaving his side, stood sentry at the door while Henry locked the satchel in a steel footlocker beneath his bed. He placed the phone next to it, already uploading backups to the cloud. The internet was slow out here, but it would finish before dawn. He turned to Ranger, who had returned to his spot by the window. "You knew, didn't you?" Henry said softly. "Before I saw them." Ranger's ears twitched, but he didn't look away from the window. The storm had slowed to a drizzle, but the tension hadn't lifted. Danger was close. too close now to ignore. The hour was just past midnight when Henry lit the last lantern in the barn. Outside, the fog clung to the fields like a drowning memory, and frost shimmered on every fence post and branch. Ranger paced back and forth by the truck, his ears swiveling at every sound, his breath hanging in the cold air like smoke. There was no time to lose. Prescott had moved faster than Henry anticipated. Word had reached him through Sarah, his tall, sharp-minded neighbor with silver blonde hair always pulled into a tight braid and a tendency to speak bluntly, that Prescott had pressured the town council into a surprise vote. The meeting was set for 7 a.m. sharp. If passed, it would officially designate the barn and the land around it as a historical site. Once that happened, Henry would lose all rights to excavate, move, or even touch what lay beneath the floorboards of the old stable. Henry's gnarled fingers worked quickly as he opened the back seat of the old Dodge truck. The seat creaked on its rusted hinge, revealing a hollow space beneath the cushion. He laid in a waterproof satchel containing the most damning pieces of history: Carter Blackwood's original journal, 3 gold coins, 2 preserved banknotes from the 1800s, and a wax-sealed letter of ownership bearing the Blackwood crest. He turned to Ranger. "We're not hiding anymore. This is ours, and we take it to the bank." Ranger gave a low chuff, eyes sharp and alert. At 7 years old, the German Shepherd was still in his prime. Muscular, swift, with a black muzzle and a long scar on his left leg from the days he'd served with Henry in Iraq. That injury had nearly cost Ranger his life. But now it served as a mark of loyalty and survival, just like Henry himself. By 3:02 a.m., they were on the road. Henry gripped the steering wheel tight, his knuckles pale. The dashboard lights cast a cold blue glow across his face, revealing deep lines carved from grief and long winters. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, alert, watching the darkness outside with disciplined stillness. The highway stretched like a ribbon of silence across Missouri's countryside. Every so often, patches of mist swallowed their headlights, and the tires hummed against the frost-crusted asphalt. But 45 minutes into the drive, Ranger growled. Henry's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. At first, nothing. Then a glint. Headlights cresting the ridge behind them, far too fast for this hour, a black SUV. Henry's pulse quickened. He pressed harder on the gas. The Dodge was old, but she had muscle where it counted. They barreled down a slope where tree shadows danced like ghosts across the road. That's when Ranger howled, a sharp, warning sound that vibrated through Henry's spine. Just ahead, at the bend near Dalton's Creek, Henry caught it, a flash of something in the road. Instinct kicked in. He yanked the wheel left, tires screeching as they narrowly avoided a pile of broken branches and metal strips, clearly laid as a trap. The SUV behind them wasn't so lucky. The screech of brakes and the unmistakable thud of impact followed. Henry didn't stop. He pushed the truck harder, the engine growling with effort as they soared past the county line. It wasn't until they reached the city limits of St. Louis that Henry finally exhaled. The frost had thickened on the windshield, but dawn had not yet touched the horizon. They still had time. At precisely 5:57 a.m., Henry pulled up in front of the Central Bank of St. Louis. The building loomed with its stone facade and tall glass doors, a remnant of the city's older elegance. A sleepy security guard at the front desk, an overweight man with a thin mustache and bleary eyes, blinked in confusion as Henry and Ranger approached. "I need to speak with Manager Clarendon," Henry said, placing a worn leather envelope on the desk. "It's about a deposit." historic in nature. Mr. Clarendon, a short, tidy man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and an expression carved from marble, appeared within 10 minutes. He wore a navy suit that seemed more comfortable on a courtroom floor than in a banquet hall. His demeanor was cold but professional. Inside the private vault room, Henry laid everything on the table: documents, currency, Carter's journal. He explained quickly, without flourish. "This needs to be locked in your top-tier security until the legal matter is resolved," Henry said, "and I need certified verification that this deposit is in my name, with time and date." Clarendon raised a skeptical eyebrow. "This is highly irregular." "So is a town trying to steal a man's birthright at sunrise," Henry snapped. Clarendon, perhaps moved by the iron resolve in Henry's voice or the badge of Ranger's military collar, nodded. "Very well." By 6:32 a.m., the deposit was secured. Digital backups had already been uploaded to Henry's secure drive. He left with a certified letter in hand, time-stamped and notarized. Ranger walked proudly beside him, tail raised, eyes still scanning. The SUV never caught up. Back on the highway, with less than 30 minutes before the town vote, Henry leaned back for a breath. "We bought time, boy," he muttered, hand resting on Ranger's neck. "Now let's see what we can do with it." The sun rose like a blade over the horizon, slicing through the haze of the long night. At the Central Bank of St. Louis, security guards were already on high alert, their radios crackling with terse chatter. In a private conference room on the second floor, Henry sat across a wide oak table from a man he had never met before, but whose word, by the end of the day, could change his life. Thomas Layton was a man of few unnecessary movements. In his early 60s, he had a tall, lean frame wrapped in a tailored gray suit, and his silver hair was combed back with military precision. His square jaw was clean-shaven, but deep lines carved across his brow gave away a life spent in scrutiny and judgment. He was a private asset appraiser, one of the most respected in the Midwest. Banks called him in when they needed absolute certainty. He neither smiled nor scowled as he opened the leather case he carried and laid out tools, gloves, and a set of high-resolution lenses. Henry sat quietly beside Ranger, who rested on the polished marble floor, his head between his paws, but his eyes always open. Every now and then, the dog's ears twitched at the subtle vibrations of boots in the hallway or the crack of distant voices. It had been a long journey, but both man and dog were carved from patient wood. Laid out in velvet-lined trays on the table were the gold coins, rare banknotes, and the small leather-bound journal belonging to Carter Blackwood. Each item had been sealed and numbered the night before by bank staff under Clarendon's watchful eye. Thomas examined them one by one with care that bordered on reverence. "These banknotes," Thomas said in a voice that barely cracked above a whisper, "are Civil War era, Series 1863, in pristine condition. This alone could fetch 6 figures at auction." He continued, pulling up a soft cloth to cradle one of the coins. "Black Liberty heads. Minted in New Orleans, 1850s. Rare. Almost uncirculated. Likely part of a Confederate treasury stockpile that never reached its destination." Henry said nothing. He had no desire for wealth, only to protect what was rightfully his. But when Thomas reached the journal, his hand slowed. He opened the brittle pages with surgical care. The first few were personal notes, weather reports, crop conditions, family reflections. But 10 pages in, he paused, adjusted his lens, and read aloud. Today, I sealed the last of the crates beneath the west stable. The war may come or go, but the land shall keep what men cannot. Signed, C.B. He looked up at Henry. There's no question. This isn't just a collection. This is a historical vault. Thomas stood and removed his gloves. Estimated total value, conservatively, $5 to $6 million. Before Henry could reply, the door burst open. Douglas Prescott strode in like a general arriving at a battlefield he already considered won. Dressed in a sleek black overcoat, his dark hair slicked back and his clean-shaven face twisted in a confident smirk, he cut a sharp contrast to Henry's earth-worn clothes. At his side was a short, hawk-eyed man in a pinstripe suit. His lawyer, obviously. The man didn't introduce himself, but carried a thick leather briefcase and a smirk to match his employer's. "This proceeding is over," Prescott declared, placing a thick folder on the table. "This treasure, as you all call it, is tied to my family history. My grandfather, William Prescott, pursued this vault for decades. His journals prove it. We have a claim." Before anyone could respond, Mr. Clarendon entered with 2 uniformed police officers at his flank. He adjusted his glasses and looked straight at Prescott. "You were not invited, Mr. Prescott, and you're not on record as a claimant. Furthermore, based on the court document filed this morning," he pulled a sheet from his folder and laid it before the officers. "The 1897 ruling by the Missouri Territorial Court affirms Carter Blackwood's sole ownership of the property and all assets found on it. Mr. Blackwood's estate now legally resides with Mr. Henry Cartwright as the land's current title holder." Prescott's expression twisted. "This is a mistake." "No," Clarendon replied coldly. "This is law." The lawyer opened his mouth, but one of the officers raised a hand. "Sir, I must advise you that interference with verified property under active legal review can be considered obstruction. Do you wish to continue?" Prescott's lips pressed into a thin line. Without a word, he turned and stormed out, the lawyer following with hurried steps. Ranger let out a low, satisfied grunt. Henry leaned back in his chair. "So, what happens now?" Clarendon gestured toward the window, where a heavy black truck was pulling into the bank's loading zone. Its armored body gleamed under the morning sun. "We're transferring the entire vault contents to an off-site facility. Federal-grade storage, no outside access. Until this matter is closed in court, which we fully expect to go in your favor, the bank will ensure its safety." Thomas added, "I'll provide sworn appraisal statements and witness documentation. This will hold up under any legal scrutiny." As the armored vehicle's team entered, tall, stoic guards in reinforced vests and mirrored sunglasses, Ranger stood and placed himself protectively at Henry's side. The vault door opened, the trays were secured into reinforced containers, and with solemn silence, the march began. By the time the vault closed again, Henry felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Justice, perhaps. Or simply the power of being seen, finally not as a relic of a dying farm, but as a man whose roots were deeper than greed could reach. The night was thick with fog, rolling across the Missouri hills like a tide of ghosts. The air smelled of wet earth and frost, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Henry had long since returned to his farmhouse after the long day at the bank, though sleep was elusive. He sat by the fireplace, sipping lukewarm coffee, while Ranger dozed at his feet, one ear still twitching to the subtlest sound. The farmhouse was quiet, too quiet. Even the old floorboards that usually creaked in their nightly ritual had fallen silent. At 1:46 a.m., Ranger shot up, eyes glowing amber in the firelight. The hair along his back bristled. A deep growl bubbled from his throat, low and primal. Henry followed his gaze to the window. At first, there was nothing but dark. Then headlights, dimmed and deliberate, flickered through the trees near the old barn. Henry stood slowly. He wore a flannel shirt and wool trousers, his calloused hands already reaching for the shotgun he kept behind the door. He didn't want to use it, but something about the night felt final. "Go," he whispered to Ranger. The German shepherd bolted out the back, vanishing into the dark with a practiced silence. By the time Henry slipped around the side of the house, crouching beneath the porch awning, he saw them. Two figures, both in black, one stockier than the other. The stocky one moved like he owned the place, bold and confident. The other fumbled with a flashlight, casting shaky beams across the barn door. It was Douglas Prescott. Even in the dark, his polished boots and expensive coat gave him away. But this time, the arrogance was gone. His shoulders were hunched, breath visible in the cold air. Prescott muttered to the man beside him, a lean, pale-faced thug with sunken cheeks and nervous hands. "Just find the box, fast. I know where he hid it." From the darkness behind the barn came a sound like rolling thunder. Ranger. One bark, sharp and furious, then another. The men froze. Prescott dropped the flashlight. Ranger exploded from the shadows, teeth bared, growling like a beast from a forgotten age. The thug ran. Prescott turned to follow, but slipped on the frost-slick grass and hit the ground hard. He tried to crawl, but Ranger stood over him, barking so fiercely the air itself seemed to tremble. Henry stepped into view with the shotgun at his side, not raised, just visible. "Don't move," he said coldly. "You picked the wrong night." 10 minutes later, red and blue lights tore through the night. Sheriff Colton Myers arrived first, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a salt-and-pepper mustache and weathered face that had seen decades of small-town drama. He wore a dark sheriff's jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and his calm presence was a balm to Henry's nerves. He greeted Henry with a nod. "Got your call. Didn't expect it'd be this dramatic." Beside him was Deputy Lena Quinn, a sharp-eyed, red-haired woman in her early 30s, with freckles across her pale cheeks and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that often made people underestimate her until it was too late. Prescott was on his knees now, hands zip-tied behind his back, his face pale, scraped from the fall and flushed with fury. "I was trying to protect my family's legacy," he barked, as if outrage would free him. Colton raised an eyebrow. "By breaking into a man's barn at 2 a.m.? He turned to Lena. "Read him his rights." The investigation began quickly. Within 24 hours, local news picked up the story. Bank records were traced. Emails leaked. It turned out that Prescott had paid a private surveillance firm, Craven and Blackwell Investigations, to tail Henry. The lean man who ran with him from the barn was one of their operatives. The firm had been bribing town council members to move up the vote, sabotaging fencing on Henry's property, and even planting false reports of hazardous materials near the well to have the land condemned. When confronted with mounting evidence, several council members flipped. They admitted to receiving gifts, luxury trips, anonymous donations, untraceable favors. By the end of the week, Douglas Prescott's name was stripped from every ballot, every committee. His family's political dynasty, which had ruled over Madison County like a shadow for generations, fell in silence. The town watched as his fortune crumbled and his arrogance turned to ash. For Henry, it was not a moment of triumph, but a release. He didn't rejoice. He simply returned to his fields, walked his land with Ranger at his side, and listened to the wind pass over the tall grass like it had for 100 years. Ranger stayed closer than ever, as if knowing the fight was truly over. One morning, Sheriff Colton stopped by. He brought papers from the county confirming Henry's permanent ownership of the land and the vault. No further disputes allowed. Colton shook Henry's hand and said, "Madison needs men like you. Quiet men. Honest ones. The kind who don't ask for anything except to be left in peace." Henry only nodded. He didn't need statues or headlines. He had the land. He had Ranger. And now he had peace. The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling hills of Missouri, casting its golden hue across the reborn fields of the Walker Ranch. Dew sparkled on the blades of grass, and a chorus of birds greeted the day as if the land itself had awakened from a long, bitter slumber. The air was warm, sweet with the scent of tilled earth and budding wildflowers. Henry Walker sat on the front porch of his farmhouse, a mug of black coffee in his hand, steam curling lazily in the morning breeze. His once wrinkled brow had smoothed slightly in recent months, and though time still carved its lines across his weathered face, his eyes were no longer haunted by shadows. They were clear now, steady and full of quiet purpose. He wore a simple plaid shirt, faded jeans, and leather boots worn from work, not war. Beside him lay Ranger, the noble German shepherd, now 7 years old. His thick coat, a blend of black and tan, shimmered under the sunlight. Though the scar above his right paw remained, a token from his service days, it no longer defined him. Today, he was simply a dog enjoying the scent of morning and the freedom of open land. Every so often, he chased a butterfly or rolled in the grass like a carefree pup. 6 months had passed since that long and brutal night when Prescott had tried to claim what was never his. Now the barn had a new roof, freshly painted in a deep red that caught the sun just right. The fencing was mended, the crops were thriving, and the stables once again echoed with the soft rustle of hay and the occasional snort of horses. Henry had used a portion of the recovered treasure to pay off every cent of debt tied to the ranch, both his and the lingering ones left behind by the Blackwood family. The rest he did not squander. Instead, he created something enduring. The Blackwood Walker Foundation was born in the spirit of redemption. Its mission was simple: to provide tools, seeds, and training to struggling farmers across the Midwest, and scholarships to children in rural areas who dreamed of a better life. Henry didn't care for ceremonies, but he quietly began receiving letters, handwritten notes from single mothers, young boys who dreamed of becoming veterinarians, or old farmers who could now plant a new season's worth of hope. One afternoon, the Sheriff's Department of Madison County held a small outdoor ceremony in the town square. A modest crowd gathered, locals in denim and sun hats, children with American flags, and a brass band composed mostly of high school students. Sheriff Colton Myers stood at the podium, holding a polished wooden box lined with velvet. Behind him, Deputy Lena Quinn smiled as she held the leash of the guest of honor, Ranger. "Some heroes walk on 2 legs," Colton said, "and some on 4. He opened the box, revealing a small silver badge shaped like a star, engraved with the words Honorary K-9 Madison County Sheriff's Department. The crowd erupted in applause as the badge was pinned gently onto Ranger's collar. The old shepherd stood proud, ears perked, eyes alert, tail wagging slowly. Henry, standing off to the side, rubbed at the corner of his eye and muttered something about dust in the wind. That evening, Sarah Beaumont stopped by. Sarah, a woman in her early 50s, was the town's librarian and an old acquaintance of Henry's from high school. She had an elegant stature, tall and slender, with auburn hair streaked with silver, often tied back into a loose bun. Her voice was soft, with a wisdom honed by years among books and people. She brought a pie, homemade, and insisted they eat it on the porch. Ranger quickly positioned himself nearby, clearly hoping for crumbs. "I read the paper today," Sarah said between bites, "about the foundation, and Ranger's medal. Madison hasn't had a hero in a long time." Henry chuckled. "I'm no hero, Sarah, just a tired old man with a lucky dog." Sarah tilted her head, eyes kind but sharp. "No, Henry, you're a man who stayed. When others gave up, you stayed." The silence between them was comfortable, the kind of silence shared only by those who have known pain and chosen to live beyond it. As night fell and the stars began their slow dance across the velvet sky, Henry leaned back in his chair, mug in hand once more. Sarah had gone home, but her voice lingered in his ears. In the distance, fireflies blinked like forgotten memories, and somewhere down by the creek, frogs began their nightly chorus. Ranger lay beside him, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded. Henry reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You kept me alive, you know," he whispered, "not just that night, all the nights." Ranger's tail thumped once. Henry stared out across the land that had once belonged to outlaws and ghosts, now returned to something pure. The treasure had given him freedom, yes, but what mattered more was something you couldn't put a price on. A companion who never left his side, a second chance at life, and the slow, steady return of hope. Some men spend their whole lives looking for riches. Henry Walker found his in loyalty, in soil, and in silence. And as the sun rose each morning, spilling light across the fields and waking the hills in gold, he knew that this simple, quiet life was worth every battle. Sometimes the greatest treasures in life are not measured in gold coins or old maps, but in quiet mornings, loyal companions, and the second chances we never thought we deserved. Henry Walker had long given up on hope. He thought he was too broken, too old, too far gone. But God works in mysterious ways. A whisper in the wind, a dog's bark in the night, a forgotten diary tucked beneath the dust of time. These were not just coincidences. They were signs, small miracles stitched into the ordinary. Proof that even when we feel lost, heaven still remembers our name. This story is not just about Henry. It's about every soul who ever sat on a porch wondering if life had anything left to offer. It's about you, the viewer, who may be carrying burdens no one else sees. Maybe today is the day your ranger comes running. Maybe the storm in your life is clearing, slowly, gently. And maybe, just maybe, grace is already on its way, hidden in the form of a friend, a stranger's kindness, or a story like this. So if this tale touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a little light. Leave a comment. We read every one. And don't forget to subscribe, because we believe in telling more stories where lost things are found and where broken people get rebuilt. May God bless you and keep you. May He send you your own quiet miracle, just when you need it most. Until then, hold on, believe, and walk with hope.